Hook for most of human history, salt was worth more than gold. Soldiers were paid in it. Wars were started over it. Entire civilizations rose and collapsed based on who controlled it. And yet today, you can buy a kilogram of table salt for less than $1. That shift alone tells you something profound about how dramatically this one mineral reshaped every aspect of human life on Earth. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover exactly how a simple compound of sodium and chloride became the most politically powerful substance in ancient history, why it sparked revolutions, funded empires, and quietly shaped the food you eat right now. We will cover trade routes built entirely around salt, wars that nobody teaches in school, and one moment in history where a single march involving salt brought down the most powerful empire in the world. That last part is genuinely surprising even if you think you already know it. Background: to understand why salt was so valuable, you need to understand what the world looked like before refrigeration. There were no freezers, no canning technology, no vacuum-sealed packaging. If you killed an animal or harvested a crop, you had days, maybe hours, before it began to rot. Salt solved that problem completely. It draws moisture out of food through a process called osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. This meant that with enough salt, you could preserve meat for months, fish for an entire year, and vegetables through an entire winter. Salt was not a seasoning. It was survival technology. The earliest evidence of salt harvesting dates back over 8,000 years to Poiana Slatinei in Romania, where archaeologists found evidence of people boiling salty spring water to extract the mineral. Ancient Chinese texts from 6,000 years ago describe salt production in detail, suggesting the practice was already mature and widespread. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, along the Mediterranean coast, wherever human settlements took hold, salt production followed. It was not optional. It was foundational. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which historians believe was connected to the Roman practice of paying soldiers in salt or giving them an allowance specifically to purchase it. The phrase "worth his salt" originates from exactly this era. Salt was currency in every meaningful sense. It was portable, universally needed, and did not spoil. It was, in economic terms, the perfect commodity. Main content: Rome built one of its most important roads specifically to transport salt. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, ran from the salt flats near the Adriatic coast all the way into Rome, and it predates much of Roman civilization itself. Control of that road meant control of the food supply, and control of the food supply meant political power. This pattern repeated itself across every major civilization on Earth without exception. In West Africa, salt was so scarce and valuable that it was traded gram for gram with gold by weight. Caravans crossing the Sahara Desert carried slabs of salt from the mines of Tagaza southward, trading them for gold dust from the kingdoms of Mali and Ghana. The city of Timbuktu became one of the wealthiest trading centers in the medieval world, largely because it sat at the intersection of salt trade routes from the north and gold routes from the south. But here is what nobody talks about. The Chinese government identified salt as a taxable commodity as early as the 7th century BC, under the management of Guanzhong, a statesman who essentially invented state revenue through monopoly control. China's salt monopoly lasted in various forms for over 2,000 years, funding dynasties, armies, and infrastructure on a scale that would be almost impossible to replicate today. The revenue generated by salt taxes was so enormous that historians estimate it funded the majority of imperial Chinese government budgets for centuries. Venice built its entire empire on salt. The city-state began in the 9th century by trading salt, harvested from lagoons in the Adriatic, to inland cities desperate for preservation technology. The profits from those early salt trades funded the merchant fleet, which then diversified into spices, silk, and everything else that made Venice synonymous with wealth and power for 600 years. Without salt, there is no Venice. Without Venice, the entire shape of European trade and the Renaissance itself might look completely different. Every 90 seconds in history, some new war, tax, or revolution was being triggered by salt access. That is only a mild exaggeration. Deep dive: the most dramatic single event in salt history happened on March 12, 1930, when Mahatma Gandhi began a 240-mile walk to the sea at Dandi on the coast of India. His goal was to illegally harvest salt from the ocean in direct defiance of British colonial law. The British Salt Act of 1882 had made it illegal for Indians to collect or sell salt without paying a heavy tax to the colonial government. This was not just economically oppressive. It was symbolically designed to control a basic resource that every human being on Earth requires to survive. Gandhi understood that salt was the perfect symbol for the independence movement because it touched every Indian regardless of caste, religion, or class. Rich, poor, Hindu, Muslim, farmer, merchant, every single person needed salt and every single person was being taxed for it. When he reached the sea on April 6 and picked up a small lump of natural salt from the mud flats, he committed a deliberate act of civil disobedience that triggered mass protests across India, filled British jails with over 80,000 non-violent resistors, and drew international attention to the independence movement in a way that permanently changed the political calculus of British colonial rule. Historians widely regard the Salt March as one of the pivotal turning points leading to Indian independence in 1947. The French salt tax, the gabelle, is another example that reshaped a civilization. Introduced in the 14th century, it required all French citizens above a certain age to purchase a minimum amount of salt per year at a price fixed by the state, regardless of whether they needed it or could afford it. The tax was deeply unpopular, unevenly applied based on region, and widely regarded as one of the most unjust forms of taxation in French history. When historians examine the root causes of the French Revolution, the gabelle appears repeatedly as a concrete, tangible example of why ordinary French citizens were willing to take to the streets against their own government. Salt also shaped the American Civil War in ways that military historians still discuss today. The Confederacy faced a catastrophic salt shortage as Union blockades cut off coastal salt production facilities. Without sufficient salt, the Confederate Army could not preserve meat for soldiers in the field. This contributed directly to food shortages, declining troop morale, and logistical collapse in the later years of the war. The Union deliberately targeted Southern salt works as a strategic military objective. Saltville, Virginia was attacked specifically because its salt production facility was considered a high-value military target. Salt was a weapon of war. Analysis: what makes salt so historically significant is not just that it was valuable. Lots of things have been valuable throughout history. What makes it extraordinary is that it was universally necessary, irreplaceable, and geographically uneven in its natural distribution. Some regions had abundant salt. Others had almost none. That imbalance forced trade, and trade forced contact between civilizations, and contact created the conditions for cultural exchange, language spread, religious transmission, and economic development. Salt routes were some of the earliest and most reliable long-distance trade networks in human history. They trained merchants, created infrastructure, established legal frameworks for commerce, and laid the groundwork for the complex global trade. Systems we take entirely for granted today. The modern global food supply chain, the logistics networks, the refrigerated shipping containers, all of it evolved from the fundamental human need to preserve food. And for most of human history, salt was the only available answer to that need. The industrialization of salt production in the 19th and 20th centuries collapsed its price so dramatically that within 2 generations, something that had shaped world history for 8,000 years became practically worthless as a commodity. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Flavor Vault for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.